Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. It's time for us to get into another zone discussion video, and this time we're moving on to the zones of WoW's first expansion, the Burning Crusade. Right off the bat, we can note some significant changes. As would be expected, we received significantly fewer new zones than the base game, a mere 12 compared to the previous 41 or so. However, as a trade-off, 7 of those 12 are noticeably larger than what we were used to. That is to say, all of the Outland zones. I'm sure in part due to the addition of flying. They're by no means the size of Dragonflight zones, mind you, but we started drifting there. And I think this was a reasonable shift from vanilla design. It's better to create fewer zones that are more distinct, iconic, and memorable than to flood us with a ton of tiny ones every expansion. There's a balance, of course. I think the War Within only giving us 4 on launch is a little underwhelming, even if we have gotten 2 patch zones already. But that's enough general commentary. Let's start things off by stepping through the Dark Portal into our first zone. Hellfire Peninsula was the exact perfect experience to start TBC out with. What could have possibly been a better stage setter? It's naturally reminiscent of the Blasted Lands that you entered from, but on an immensely grander scale. Even the Dark Portal is larger on this side. You're immediately exposed to a grand battle between the forces of the Horde and Alliance and the Legion, before being sent off to your respective bases. The zone is admittedly a barren wasteland, but it's a vast barren wasteland in space. The vibrant red soil and twisting nether skybox continuously remind you of that fact. There are Legion forces throughout the zone and a hefty Fel Orc presence, particularly around the centerpiece of the zone, Hellfire Citadel, which is, slightly bigger on the inside than the outside. Thrallmar and Honor Hold, featuring Nazgrel from Warcraft 3 and Denath Trollbane from Warcraft 2, make for good starting towns, giving you that orc and human vibe, but both are also dilapidated and barely getting by. You're in a hostile new world and no longer the big cheese that you once were. Of course, there are other settlements as well, most notably the Draenei Temple of Tel Hamat and the Blood Elf Falcon Watch that help add some variety. There are also the 3 open world PvP objectives that didn't get much attention because the reward was a 5% buff. You also had the Pools of Agonar, our first introduction to the Maghar, the Throne of Kil'jaeden to later return to. Oh, and did I mention the Path of Glory that's literally paved with Draenei bones? This zone goes hard, and there's no way I could talk about HFP without mentioning everyone's favorite rogue race, the Fel Reaver. Seriously, considering how large they are and how booming and iconic their sound alert is, it's amazing that they ever managed to sneak up on you. Yet, they do. We had vaguely similar recreations of these with the level 80 giants in Howling Fjord and the whale sharks in Bashir, but none of them could truly replicate the experience. Objectively, by modern standards, a lot of Outland zones are quite rough, but the peninsula absolutely owns the vibes it's putting out, and I adore it for that. Moving on, although we do get a bit of a transition with some withered up mushrooms on the west end of Hellfire Peninsula, there still could not be a more stark contrast between it and its neighbor, Zangarmarsh. And honestly, thank goodness for that. As much as I praise HFP, by the time you finished it, you'd kind of had your fill of dry, scarred land. Fortunately, the marsh is here for you to slake your thirst. Do you like mushrooms? Do you like lakes? Well then, have I got amazing news for you. But seriously, Zangarmarsh is quite the delight. Both factions get to enjoy the Cenarian Refuge in the east of the zone, as well as 2 additional main settlements. While the Horde won out in functionality, the Alliance got a town on top of the mushrooms with Tel'Rador, and that's just way cooler. There were also the lovable Sporelings and their village in the west called Sporagar. If you got tired of the blue color palette, you could always head to the Deadmire in the northeast of the zone. Personally, I spent a lot of time in Quag Ridge, south of Zabra Jin. Having swapped mains to my Holy Priest, I relied on my Enhancement Shaman alt to farm fungal giants here for Motes of Life to sell for gold. This zone also had 2 PvP objectives that were also ignored. And of course, the centerpiece for this zone was Coilfang Reservoir, and this is how you do a dungeon hub. Of course we have to swim through the pipes to get inside. It's perfect. I don't think I appreciated Zangarmarsh as much as I should have back in the day, but without it, I think Outland would have been a lot harder to stomach as a whole. Next up, we have Terakar Forest. I can certainly imagine WoW players who weren't active during TBC deeming this zone kind of lame. Heck, it certainly wasn't my favorite back in the day. but nostalgia is a heck of a drug, and I've grown a strange appreciation for it. Granted, my thoughts toward it were very distinct from Shatrath City, which I hold in very high regard, but won't elaborate on much here. The forest itself always felt like two separate zones, the actual forest and the bone wastes surrounding Auchindoun. It wasn't until much later that I fully grasped that the wastes are the way they are because Auchindoun blew up from the Shadow Council trying to summon Murmur, so they very much belong in the same zone. And with Auchindoun we have, yet again, a centerpiece of the zone with 4 dungeons/raids inside. Bit of a trend there, huh? The zone is also, interestingly enough, named after the Arakoa's greatest king, Terok. Our interaction with the Arakoa is mostly limited to the subzone of Skedis and the Sethic Hall's dungeon, and a bit in Blade's Edge Mountains. It's funny to think how that fairly small area serves as the remnants of what we would see in WoD as the Spires of Arak. The Arakoa are a bizarre part of Outland and Draenor lore that feels fairly isolated, and, for that reason, difficult to keep straight in my head. Maybe I'll do a deep dive into all that one day and educate myself. This zone also has a PvP objective, the 6 spirit towers surrounding Auchindoun that only become active every 6 hours. Still not a ton of activity there. At any rate, the bulk of the zone is this deep green with whitish green serving as the highlight color, usually through crystals jutting out near the tree bases. Nowadays, I can recognize a tranquil beauty to the place. I just feel like that tranquility is hard to really feel due to the things like basilisks, spiders, wolves, warp stalkers, and Kaleri everywhere. Oh gosh, the Kaleri, I just remembered why I hated this zone and its stupid monstrous Kaleri flying around Skedis. They'd always daze you off your mountain, make you fall to your death, or at least make you slow fall. Screw these birds and screw this zone, we should just burn it to the ground. Burn it! Moving on to Nagrand, left parenthesis, Outland, right parenthesis. Yes, I had to say the whole thing because that's how the game displays it on the guild roster now. They could have just named the WoD version something different, but whatever. Who doesn't like Nagrand? It's pretty widely regarded as one of the most beautiful zones in the game, and only Sourfang really disputes that. Certainly for its era, it was phenomenal, but I do think that time has been less kind to the place, mainly its grass textures, and I wouldn't mind Blizzard going back and just updating that one little detail. Aside from that though, it really is gorgeous. Basically, what if we took a lush prairie and stuck it in space? Instant success. The floating islands are iconic, of course. Garadar was a very cozy hub for the Horde, and Talar was, again, pretty cool, overlooking a chasm. And of course, there was Oshugun, the Orcs' sacred mountain of spirits, that's actually a crash-landed Dranic space fortress, which is kind of a dig at both races. One doesn't understand that they're exalting a spaceship, and the other seems to have a running gag of crash landing said spaceships. But it looks cool and has these cool crop circle-like designs around it. Yet again, we have a PvP objective here, the last one we'll encounter, and this one, Hala, actually saw activity. Probably mostly due to it having actually semi-useful vendors that only the controlling faction could access, as well as making navigation around the center of the zone far easier for anyone who had not yet unlocked flying. There was also the Ring of Trials. I really appreciate when arenas and battlegrounds are actually represented in the game world, even though that basically never happens. Nagrand is also fascinating because it didn't really have any endgame content. No dungeons, no raids, no level 70 only subzone, but it had the absolute best questing for leveling characters. This included one of the first poop quests, as well as the first Ring of Blood style quests, where you group up to kill an elite mob in an arena, and then do it again 4 more times. And best of all, we had the return of Hemet Nesingwary and his hunting party. Again, we're sent out to hunt 184 wild animals of various types, and it's just a grand old time. I know Hemet would return several more times over the years, but I feel like each time they diluted the experience a bit by trying to shake up the formula. But that's not what I want out of Nesingwary quests. I want them to all be the same, an absolute slaughterfest of the local fauna. I think I've hit on all the important stuff. Nagrand is awesome. Probably overrated compared to the other zones, but still awesome. Jumping up north, we have the Blade's Edge Mountains. I love the idea of the place, a zone defined by its thousands of massive spikes, many of which are decorated with the corpses of black dragons. In practice though, it's kind of a hideous mess. Occasionally WoW will produce zones that feel more like a mishmash of smaller ideas, and the result winds up being a bit of a quilt that can hurt the overall integrity of the zone, even if the separate elements are perfectly enjoyable. Except in Blade's Edge's case. Those separate elements aren't perfectly enjoyable. You sort of have 4 biomes going on here, all interspersed. The least significant of these are the small areas that have been taken over and corrupted by the Legion. Stretching across the center of the zone, you have what I call the Dust Bowl. This is where Gruul's Lair, the Circle of Blood, Sibelian, and a bunch of ogres can be found. It's very brown, and not a pretty brown. Then there are the forested areas scattered throughout, but it's Blade's Edge, so of course these have to feel dry and itchy too. These are where you can find Rexar's base, as well as the Moknathal village. There's also a village called Sylvanar, which you would think is a horde settlement named after Sylvanas, following the same naming convention of Thrallmar. But nope, it's Night Elves. Not even High Elves, so that you could argue Ilaria founded it and named it after her sister. I know Sylvan means foresty stuff, so obviously both derived from the same root, but it still feels weird to me. And then we have the last biome, the tan/orange crystal ridges, 2 of which are max level subzones, and all of which are distinguished by their large apexis crystals. One of these areas is where you can find the settlement of Ogre-La, populated by hyper-intelligent ogres. Oh, and to get to the zone, you either have to go through an annoyingly long cave, or fly way up over the spike walls. At least the transition to Netherstorm is much cooler with the gyroplank bridge. Oh, and if you thought getting into the zone was bothersome, try getting around the zone. Most of those quilt patches require you to go up or down massive natural ramps that are only located in a few spots, with only 2 bridges in the zone. But one subzone requires you to cross a bridge and go through a cave. So fun. Look, I'm giving the zone a lot of flack, but I do still appreciate it, oddly enough. It's those dang nostalgia goggles. I do really like the background info of the place basically forming from Frostfire Ridge and Gorgrond crashing into one another. Still, I have to be honest with myself here. It's got a lot of design weaknesses. Blizz, whenever you design future zones, do not look to this one as inspiration. To the east, we have Netherstorm. What if, and hear me out here, Hellfire Peninsula, but purple? Yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it. In that regard, it feels extremely lazy, and it really is just so much purple. Purple and pink. I don't dislike the look, but it's a lot, you know? Having said all that, I think the place does have a lot of merits. It easily feels like the most outer spacey of Outland zones, both due to its natural geography and the structures located within. There's the Goblin Town of Area 52, there are the mana forges located throughout, as well as the pipes, all leading to the dungeon/raid hub of Tempest Keep, which is basically a giant fortress with 3, formerly 4 ships attached. And there are the Ego Domes, which preserve the last remnants of nature from when the place was the vibrant Farallon, which provided some much needed reprieve from the pink with some green. But only if you're actually inside, otherwise they're just giant pink bubbles to add to the pink and purple rocks. The zone is also divided into 6 main islands, only connected by a few bridges. Thankfully, the rest of the terrain is bearable enough that this still doesn't feel nearly as restrictive as Blade's Edge. Plus, you were far more likely to be 70 and have flying for the entirety of your time here. We also have a small Netherwing area and the Kirinvar village to throw a bit more variety our way. At the end of the day, despite kind of being HFP with a paint job, it still manages to feel distinct. So while I don't encourage that kind of zone design, I do have to commend the team for pulling that off with only a few unique assets. It's a solid mid-tier zone for TBC. And of course, in the modern day, with patch 11.2 on the horizon, it's very interesting to see how many elements were incorporated into Koresh. Obviously, you have everything with the Ethereals, including the Nexus King Salhadar, the Mana Forges, and Dementius himself. But you also have the Ego Domes making a return, and I'm quite eager to experience the new zone for myself. Way down to the south, we have Shadowmoon Valley, left parenthesis, Outland, right parenthesis. What if, and hear me out here, Hellfire Peninsula, but green? Yep, they did it again. Outland zone design really squeezed all they could out of limited resources, didn't it? Again, to be absolutely fair, they managed to use relatively few new assets to create a somewhat different feeling environment. It was, at least prior to Legion, the most fel-stricken location the game had to offer. The zone's most significant structure is the Black Temple, which, somewhat annoyingly, has an invisible wall thrown around it. However, the centerpiece of the zone is clearly the giant fell volcano, the Hand of Gul'dan, that transformed the once serene and beautiful valley we see in WoD into the gray and green grimscape that it is now. That being said, I think there are other bits to appreciate about the place. You of course have everything related to Netherwing Ledge, the Warden's Cage, and the pretty hype Terrangorfing quest chain. The Horde get to set up shop in Shadowmoon Village, and the Alliance in Kurdran's Wildhammer Stronghold, both of which I'm sure I didn't appreciate the significance of back in the day. That's honestly true of most of Outland. I was a Warcraft 3 baby, so I mostly only appreciated the ties to the Frozen Throne. Of course, it didn't help that most important NPCs were visually indistinct from the chaff. In addition, we had the Altar of Shatar and the Sanctum of the Stars, quest hub and flight points tied to the Aldor and Scryer locations, which I think is just really cool and exactly the kind of thing they should do more of with choice factions. Also, they should do more choice factions. My overall feelings are very similar to that of Netherstorm. Easy to criticize the shortcomings of, but still a zone that established its own identity, and which I do appreciate. That's it for Outland zones, but the Burning Crusade also brought us quite a lot in terms of new low-level zones. Let's start things off by heading off the coast of Kalimdor. Azure Mist Isle. If I were to describe this zone in one word, it would be peaceful. I mean, nothing says peaceful more than crash landing a spaceship onto an island, sending crystalline debris all over the place, and having your passengers pulled out of the wreckage to start their journey. Despite that though, it really is a very calm and soothing area. Blizz was generally pretty dang good at making starting zones feel quaint and unintimidating. It's got a pleasant combination of darkish green evergreen trees with purple flowers, and pink-purple crystals strewn throughout. I guess you could say its color palette is a far less saturated version of Kata-era Silverpine Forest. It's also incredibly easy to become endeared to the Draenei here. They're such a likable people, easily my favorite Alliance race. The massive Exodar exterior serves as an easy landmark throughout much of the zone. Not that you particularly need it given the fairly small size. Perhaps contributing to its serenity is that the most dangerous mobs you'll face here are some Furbolg, Moonkin, and Naga, with the wildlife threats being sabers and moths, and at the very worst, the Kirkin. In WoW terms, that's all pretty tame. Another factor could be that, being on the Outland World server, it's mainly accessed through a boat from Darkshore and eventually portals. But there's so few reasons to go there that nobody ever does. Having said all that, I'm pretty sure that I consider this my second favorite TBC zone. It's just so tranquil. Next up, there's Bloodmist Isle. Located to the north of Azure Mist Isle, we have its twin and what could possibly be the most isolated open world zone in the game, because you aren't getting to Bloodmist without going through Azure Mist first, and there are even fewer reasons to go there. One could easily deem it just a recolor, and it isn't hard to see why. They very much look like related zones, and the Draenei literally renamed it to almost have the same name. But the red everywhere was the result of radiation delivered onto the land by the Exodar's crash, and has caused the zone to change in more significant ways as well, such as the foliage itself taking on a more bladed structure. And though it predated the crash, the hauntingly charred Wormscar Isle is quite the standout visual. Crystals continue to be a theme here, both those from the crash and the Dranic architecture, as well as from the Blood Elves who had attacked the Exodar in the first place. I'm also a big fan of how the questing culminates in you charging up the Vector Coil to stop the Minari Eridar Saronis from maintaining a portal to Outland, which would bring in more Sunhawk Blood Elf reinforcements. Nowadays, the zone is probably best known for screenshots of players accumulating like 20 quests to turn in all at once in Bloodwatch, which is of course so satisfying. I think many people are probably put off by the zone's color palette. I can imagine them finding the combination of saturated reds and oranges along with purple and dark green highlights to be garish. But I don't know, I think it looks really good. It's certainly not something I've seen anywhere else. So thank you, Bloodmist. You may be the easiest to miss TBC zone, but I'll never forget you and your wonderfully unique appeal. Across the world, at the northern tip of the Eastern Kingdoms, we have Eversong Woods. Apparently, this was the first zone made for TBC, which kind of blows my mind. This was their first crack at a new zone? Of course, I may be thinking of it backwards. If it was there first, that means it had the most time to receive polish. At any rate, Eversong Woods is easily my favorite TBC zone. Honestly, I think it may be my favorite zone in the entire game. It's that near and dear to me. Also, I realize going with this one is a bit of a risky pick for me, considering there's a non-zero chance we'll get an updated version in midnight, which we'll be getting a full reveal of in less than a month. And if we are getting a new version, you would assume that it blows the original out of the water. Then again, if they do make another version, it's probably going to have large swaths painted purple by the Void, or even worse, infested with Alliance, so this is probably a safe pick. Simply put, Eversong is gorgeous. It's got all the advantages of an early level forest like Elwyn Forest, but with just enough of a magical spin on it to make it perfect. It has a very autumnal color palette, but manages to exude a warmth to it that makes you feel like a cozy summer day. The trees also possess a very magical twistiness to them, if that makes sense. And of course, there is the Blood Elven architecture featured throughout, which is some of the best that the game has to offer. There are just a billion places in this zone where I would want to lay down and take a nap. Probably not in the Dead Scar, that's the one ugly element to the place, but it's an important story feature, so I'm glad it's there. I have a ton of nostalgia for the place. It may not have been my WoW origin story. In fact, the Blood Elf Mage that would start out as my pet alt and evolve into my main, eventually to be race changed to a Nightborn, was my 5th character. Even so, this is still, in a sense, my main character's home. I still remember doing the quest to use Mana Tap 3 times on the worms on Sunstrider Isle. I remember climbing my way to the top of Falthrian Academy, working my way south to Falconwing Square, and eventually Fairbreeze Village. I love how the dark nature the Blood Elves took back then in order to survive their magic withdrawal contrasted so starkly with the serene majesty of the place. Oh, and I remember running up to the gate in Torwatha, wondering when we were going to get a dungeon there. It had a big Zul'Aman-esque troll gate, for crying out loud. And then they patched it away and put more mountains in the way. I've always said that although I don't care that much about player housing, if we ever did get it and could choose any zone, that Eversong would be the automatic winner for me. Seriously, I only have 2 complaints about the zone. The first is that it's stuck on the Outland World server, which means a bunch of smoke and mirror design elements and it being, in a sense, separated from the rest of the Eastern Kingdoms. The second is that it isn't real, because I want to live there forever and ever. South of Eversong, we have Ghostlands. This feels like the perfect transition between the mostly immaculate beauty of Eversong Woods and the pestilent dead zone that are the Eastern Plaguelands. Most of the zone clearly had the life drained from it, but the Scourge didn't really have time to set up shop and fully plague the land to oblivion. Instead, it still looks like an actual forest, just with much of the color and sunlight missing. I know I'm weird for thinking this, but the zone is hauntingly beautiful in a way. If you do want to go full Scourge, you can head down to Deathholm, where the questing culminates with you eliminating Darkhan Drathir, the traitor who most enabled Arthas and the Scourge in their campaign into Quel'Thalas. But thankfully, it's not all Scourge content. To the west, we have Windrunner Spire, and much of the eastern half of the zone is devoted to the Amani, their catacombs, and the entrance to Zul'Aman. As we see from the raid, the Amani lands on the whole seem far less affected by the Third War. Perhaps we'll get to see more of them in Midnight. The Ghostlands are admittedly not the largest zone, and that becomes readily apparent just looking at how big the text and features on the map are compared to others, but I don't feel the zone is too small either. It feels perfectly suited for the role it fills. And Tranquillian serves as a nice little fusion of Blood Elf and Forsaken forces, as well as joining Bloodwatch as one of the best hubs in the game for amassing 20 quests to turn in all at once. So satisfying. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention those filthy Night Elf spies you get to kill. And I appreciate that they did bother to connect it to the rest of the Eastern Kingdoms through the Thalassian Pass, even if it was through a loading screen and very much not a seamless transition. So overall, a very well-made zone that sadly most players probably only think of when Zul'Aman is relevant. And finally, we have the Isle of Quel'Danas. This zone has the prestige of being the very first one ever added to the game via a patch. And it's not great. Don't get me wrong, it's gorgeous, but that's just because it uses the literal exact same assets as Eversong Woods. And frankly, it's tiny, with most of the center of the isle being used up by the raid. Don't get me wrong, I had a ton of fun on the isle back in the day, It was an engaging enough hub and very easy on the eyes. I also remember the different buildings of the town being unlocked over time, slowly adding more daily quests and more amenities for you to take advantage of. Well, in hindsight, I'm not sure that was time-based or rep-based. I know the last 3 Sunwell Plateau bosses unlocked over time though. I do remember thinking that it was weird that the Sunwell was located on this distant island instead of on the mainland. Why make such a weird change? Yeah, I was dumb, because even in Warcraft 3 maps it was depicted as being on a separate landmass. It's just that the actual mission where you use the Sunwell to revive Kel'Thuzad has it in Silvermoon City, so that level is the real oddity. This was actually mostly remedied in Warcraft 3 Reforged, where the map was flipped, the Sunwell was moved to an island, and Arthas creates the ice bridge necessary to access it. Oh, and Anasterian Sunstrider and Thalorian Dawnseeker were added. Honestly, one of the very few Reforged levels that actually made significant changes to better reflect the lore. I wish they'd done more of that while preserving the original versions. That was a big tangent, but the main takeaway is the zone looks great and was fun to experience, but is small and loses credit in my eyes for aesthetically just being more Eversong Woods and not its own thing. And that's all 12 TBC zones. I guess for as interesting and exotic as most of the Outland zones are at an individual level, I tended to appreciate the Azeroth leveling zones more. Maybe Outland just leaned too heavily into the destroyed world look, which is perfectly reasonable, but also harder to fall in love with. So I'm glad that they and the others were all added at a time when I was perfectly poised to let nostalgia poison my views on them. Wait, could it be that Bloodmist Isle isn't actually red? Does it just look that way because of my rose-tinted glasses? No, I was right before. It is very, very red. And yes, clearly for this week's drawing, I went with Eversong Woods. And I actually had a lot of difficulty just scouting out a location that I wanted to use. This is because I was putting way too much significance on this zone, as it is probably my favorite, and because I don't have one specific favorite spot. The whole zone is good. So ultimately I just tried to find a spot that would let me feature the grass, the trees, the architecture, the rivers, while being able to throw in some wildlife. I know that there was no way for me to ever capture the beauty of this zone, but I am nevertheless pretty satisfied with how it turned out. All I can say is bravissimo to anyone who had any hand in the creation of this masterpiece of a zone. It is at the very least among the best that the game has to offer. And that'll do it for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye bye.